And now, marine weather around Alaska. Welcome aboard. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service with this Alaska marine weather outlook for Monday and Tuesday in the early week ahead. As we start out on this Sunday afternoon, September 10th, we look at the sea ice edge and really even the Arctic waters through the Chukchi Sea along the coastline there in the Arctic coast from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik have open water. We're about a week or so away from minimal ice extent up here across the Arctic. And then thereafter, as we head into early October, we'll see the new season ice begin to take shape as temperatures continue to cool. Well, looking at the map later tonight, early on Monday morning, we'll have a low pressure lifting into the central Gulf. This feature will pull northward toward the Gulf Coast, northern Gulf Coast. This frontal band will increase winds, especially along the outer coast of the Panhandle and northeastern Gulf, just below gale force most areas. It's also going to send another surge of moderate to locally heavier precipitation into areas here of the northern Gulf Coast, including Prince William Sound around Valdez, Cordova to almost Yakutat. Yakutat's picked up nearly 5 inches of rainfall for Friday and Saturday and early this Sunday morning. And then weaker low pressure resides further north, a couple of weak lows out across the Bering Sea. By the time we get into Monday afternoon, there's the low lifting its way up toward the northern Gulf Coast. Another low is going to take residence here toward Bristol Bay. That'll be the next low of any substance. A little breezy around that, and a couple other weaker lows here just west of St. Lawrence Island off the Russian coast, and another out toward the central Bering. And for Tuesday, the feature that was pushing into the northern and northeastern Gulf washes out, and then that Bristol Bay low tries to make a little inroad a little further east. But as I mentioned, we have a mid and upper level wheel of low pressure that's just kind of keeping general low pressure across much of the state of Alaska. And this pattern, this early, somewhat seasonably cool and occasionally wet fall pattern will continue in the week ahead. Looking at the marine forecast on Monday for the southeast panhandle, for the outer coast, we're anticipating southeast winds becoming easterly once you get west of Yakutat, 25 to 30 knots, waves generally running 10 to 12 feet. Inner channels, southeast winds strongest down here toward Dixon Entrance, around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, 40 knots from the southeast, waves as high as 9 feet. 5-footers there within Stevens Passage, 20 knot southeast winds up there through Lynn Canal with 4-foot waves. And then on Tuesday, look for wind and waves to come downward for the inner channels. Southeast winds around 15 knots, waves generally running 3, maybe 4 feet there as you get toward Dixon Entrance. For the outer coast, off of Craig, look for south winds 15 knots, 8-foot waves. Winds otherwise generally southeasterly, right around 15 knots as you get west of Craig and Sitka off to west there of Yakutat, with waves generally running 7 to 8 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, not as windy off the Seward Peninsula. Variable winds 15 knots, north winds 10 knots there in Prince William Sound with a couple of foot waves. Upper Cook Inlet, variable winds at 10 knots. Kinnick and Turnagain Arm, waves a couple of feet. Winds will be westerly, though, at the entrance of Cook Inlet at 20 knots with waves running about 5 feet. And then winds come down even further. Generally variable winds around 10 knots across much of the region on Tuesday. More of an easterly wind perhaps in Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. Otherwise, within Cook Inlet, waves running just a foot or two, and off of the Kenai coast, waves 3 to 4 feet. Looking at the Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island will see west-southwest winds around 20 knots on Monday, waves 5 feet, Shelikof Strait, 7 feet off of Akiak. And then a core of little stronger winds, higher waves will be pushing into north of Cold Bay there, westerly, southwesterly, 25 knots with waves of 6 to 7 feet on the Bering side. And as we move into Tuesday, variable winds up around Kodiak Island at 10 knots and waves a couple of feet within Shelikof Strait. Otherwise, winds generally southwest to west, 20 knots or so, either side on the Bering or the North Pacific with waves 4 feet on the North Pacific side and as high as 7 feet here off of the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula up into areas of Bristol Bay. Looking at the Aleutian chain on Monday, generally westerly winds near 20 knots. For areas in the North Pacific side, waves generally running about 5 feet. On the Bering side, we could be seeing waves as high as 7 feet north there of Dutch Harbor. Otherwise, 4 or 5 feet working westward toward Atka and Adak. And then on Tuesday, westerly winds 15 knots, eastern Aleutians will turn more northwesterly, 20 to 25 knots, Nikolsky westward through Atka and Adak back toward Kiska, with waves on the North Pacific side 6 to 7 feet once you get west of Unalaska, and 7 to 8 feet there, Nikolsky westward, around 4 or 5 feet in the vicinity of the eastern Aleutians around Dutch Harbor. And then for the southeast area of the Bering Sea and the southwest coast, there will be a low circulation setting up here on Monday. Southwest winds into Bristol Bay, 15 knots, 3-foot waves. Southeast winds Kuskokwim Bay with 3-foot waves, but on the backside, north winds 20 knots, St. Matthew. Westerly winds to 30 knots around the Pribilov Islands with waves as high as 10, 11 feet. As we go up the coast, kind of a mixed bag of winds, 5 to 10 knots off of the lower Yukon Delta into Norton Sound with waves generally running a couple of feet there. By the time we get into Tuesday, variable winds around the Pribilovs at St. Paul, 10 knots, 5-foot waves. Generally north to northwest winds, 10 to 15 knots within Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays with waves there 3-4 feet. Off of the lower Yukon Delta, winds will be northwesterly 5 to 10 knots with waves a couple of feet, maybe a little brisker through Etolin Strait. And then looking at the far north, south of the Bering Strait, winds will be south-southwest 5 to 10 knots, waves 1 to 2 feet. Winds through the lower Chukchi Sea variable at 5 to 10 knots with waves running a couple of feet there. But as we go up along the northwest coast, winds will be northeasterly 15 knots off of Point Lay and Wainwright, waves a few feet there. And then easterly winds 15 knots along the Arctic coast from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik with waves 3 to 4 feet there on Monday. And then Tuesday, look for those winds to turn westerly along the Arctic coast from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik with waves 3 to 4 feet or so. Down through the Chukchi Sea, winds will be south-southwest 10 to 15 knots with waves of 2 to 3 feet. And then south of the Bering Strait, winds will generally be out of the north-northwest around 10 knots with waves running a couple of feet, especially off of Point Clarence and Wales and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island.